name's Melissa Levine. I'm the lead copyright officer at the University of Michigan Library. I've been there for 5, 6, 7 years. It's been quite an adventure. I am a lawyer by training. I've worked in museums and libraries for many years. I got hooked in museum work when I was an undergraduate at Emory, and I was literally filling out permission forms for a catalog or for postcards or something, and I thought, I could be a lawyer and make my parents happy and still work in a museum. And little did I know that I was sort of right, but it's not exactly a straight path. Bob has talked to you a little bit about the HathiTrust's digital library. This is one of those slides that we use to update the scale, constantly, but it really emphasizes the scale of what we're talking about. Over 11 million volumes as of like this week. We know a lot of them are in the public domain. So I'm just curious, how many of you came to this talk thinking we're going to be talking about orphan works? Thank goodness, because that's not the chat we're having today. I want to talk about the public domain because, in theory, it's a much clearer space. Copyright has a term; it ends. The end, right? And it's if you're here, you know it's actually not that simple. So we're looking at this growing corpus of work that we have in digital form, that we can do things that we could never do with let's just focus on books for this conversation right now, in ways that are really new and exciting and compelling. We have a huge investment in our collections as a community of libraries and as a thinking more collectively as a public good in some way. You think about really the millions of dollars just in the collection acquisition alone over, let's say, 200 years, represented by the libraries that are already participating in Hathi and beyond that. And then you look at who has what and who doesn't have the same materials. There's, the collections they don't overlap completely, as they shouldn't. And you sort of say, okay, well, what is in the public domain? Because now that we have this new format and we have these, I'm interested in Jim Neal's post-digital conversation because I haven't figured out the digital yet. But what do we know? We don't really know that much about the rights status. That is not something that was emphasized, let's say, at the point of cataloging. Okay, so this is a really important area where I can see important growth for technical services. But basically, it's how is this relevant? Catalogers would put in information into a record saying how they viewed it as relevant for a particular kind of research. And we have very good catalog records that are very good for what they're for, but they're only a step above useless for a lot of the copyright analysis. So and that is not a criticism of the cataloging. It's just we have different tools and different needs at the moment. So as you heard, Anne, who I can't overstate the foundational work that Anne did on this project. She worked on this before I started at the University of Michigan, as did Zach. And we have 2 grants, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of them. The project initially started looking at books published in the United States between 1923 and 1963. And that was a time frame. They focused on that because there were formalities. That was a time frame. Today we generally have a life plus a term of years sort of formula for determining public domain. At that time, before the 1976 Act, you had to register a work, you had to have a copyright notice on a work, you had to renew it if you wanted a second term of copyright. And unfortunately, the U.S. Copyright Office records are not very accessible for that time frame. The ones from, I think, 77 on are online, and you can search them. It's not the fanciest database, but it works for most things. But the earlier records aren't online. And what really springboarded this project forward was that Stanford worked on a project to digitize the renewal records and put them in a database that is very easy to use. So that was a pivotal piece of information. And you'll see as a theme of this, we sort of develop a methodology, but we're constantly looking for other ways to make it better and springboarding other pieces of work that people in our community or beyond are doing. So we started with books from the United States, 1923 to 63. And then more recently, we've added Australian, Canadian, and British books. Those are all Berne Convention countries. That's the main international treaty that deals with copyright. And they're all, in theory, countries where you can make, if you know the death date of the author, you can make a determination about the copyright status of the book. So I really come back to this theme. Day to day, the work can be really tedious and really complicated. And when you keep in mind you're really fulfilling the promise of the public domain, it really helps keep your eyes above the horizon a little bit. And I just happen to really like that slide. So how many of you are Futurama fans? Okay. I really thought it was horrible. And then my son hit adolescence, and we were watching it a lot. And the more I looked at it, the more intriguing and really quite smart it is. And there's this shtick where they have, this is a comedy cartoon, it's really geared for adults, that happens in the year 2000, or 4,000 something. It's like 2,000 years from now, let's say. It's the future. And in the future, there are like cryogenically sealed heads. So they've got like Richard Nixon, and they've got Justin Bieber, and they have different shtick where these people are dead, but they're alive. And it's just their heads in a jar. And we sort of started thinking, if you could do that in the future, could you have copyright last forever? Like, is this dead or is this alive? And this is when you know you're taking your work home a little too much. So, okay, so CRMS today. So this first chart shows the work that was done on those US books I was just talking about. We finished in January of this year the main body of candidates that we had in the HathiTrust corpus, 304,000 odd determinations. So that's how many determinations we made. Of those, about half were in the public domain. About 17% were still subject to copyright. And about 30% we couldn't make a determination for a number of reasons. And I'll talk about that in a moment later. We have this undetermined category, which I view as sort of our release valve when you can't make a decision for some reason. Sometimes there are parts of our methodology that you put things aside, but sometimes if you try and figure it out, you will be stuck, and we don't want people wasting time. So on the other side, you have CRMS World. So you can see that only started in 2012 as part of our second IMLS grant, and this is the body of material that's from the UK, Canada, and Australia. So in less than 2 and a half years, we've made 74,000 determinations. 69% of those thus far are in the public domain. 17% are in copyright, and 15% are in this undetermined category. I don't know, when we've looked at comparative charts over time, what's really interesting is the overall proportions in those three categories, both in US and world, fall roughly in the same allocation. It'll be interesting when we get through a larger body of the foreign works to see how this holds true or doesn't. So these are just also images to reflect sort of the high end is where we start with a candidate pool, and over time, how we've worked through them. Just like HathiTrust has partners, we work with HathiTrust partners to do this project. And one of the main, there's a couple reasons, but one of them is it's a very administrative issue. We're showing scans that may be in copyright. So we have to work with trusted partners who have access to an interface. Zach, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about those parameters, okay? So while in theory it would be great if we could expand the kinds of people who could do reviews outside of HathiTrust, it's plenty work right now just to stay inside of it, and especially because we are allowing people to look at scans that may be subject to copyright. There's fairly high security requirements around that. The first grant started with partnership with Michigan, along with Indiana, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And they have been steadfast collaborators since the beginning of the CRMS effort. So when I say partners in this slide, they happen to all be HathiTrust partners, but I really mean it sort of in the sense of working on the copyright review management system partnership. So all of these institutions in the bottom part of the slide have committed cost share. And in grant talk, in grant speak, that means they have formally committed staff time, like contractually, to the federal government to work on this project. And that is really significant, but there's a few things that are significant. This is a lot of institutions. I can't recall what this represents offhand in terms of dollars, but $1 million of staff time, a lot. We're talking a lot of dollars altogether. And some institutions committed fairly small amounts of time, others very significant investments, but it reflects the importance of the issue to many of these libraries. What's also interesting is we are starting to get requests from libraries who are not CRMS cost share partners. They're HathiTrust's partners, but they want to participate in the review process. So we're currently training. When I say we, it's a royal we. I think Anne or Christina pointed out Rick Adler and Christina Eden, who are with me from Michigan. It's the royal we. It's not just me. In fact, it's as little of me as I can possibly work it out to be. But Christina is actually training people from Ohio State University and from McGill. And McGill is the first institution from outside the United States to start working on this project. So we're very excited about that. We also, in the first grant, we didn't have an advisory group. And I think partly that was because the powers that be were figuring out what this was and how to make it work. And maybe it didn't even occur to them that would, I'm not even sure that would have been helpful at that stage of the game. In the second grant, we put together an advisory group. So these are all people from who have copyright expertise. Some of them are names you may recognize. Jack is the general counsel at the University of Michigan. He's in their general counsel's office, excuse me. And he works quite extensively on HathiTrust issues and on copyright. Georgia Harper is at the University of Texas. Kenny Cruz is just left Columbia and is in private practice. Peter Hurdle straddles Cornell and Harvard. Kevin Smith is at Duke. Jessica Lippman is on the faculty at the University of Michigan. Bobby Glushko was working with us on this project and has left. He's at the University of Toronto and in a similar kind of position and is continuing to help us. And Sharon Farb just joined us from UCLA. Sharon is, for me, a very important addition because she is very involved with HathiTrust, and she's involved with thinking about collections. And as we're thinking about the longer term, I'm thinking about copyright as a collection issue. And we can just discuss that more if that's interesting for you later. Okay, so grant number 1, we were talking about works published in the United States between 23 and 63. We talked a little bit about formalities. We had a number of well-established, accessible resources. We did not have VIAF at the beginning. Do you know what VIAF is? Okay, so initially we didn't have that tool. But we did have the Library of Congress authority files and so forth. So the basic methodology that Anne and her colleagues developed at the time was to have reviews performed by catalogers. 2 reviews would happen independently. So I'll show you what the interface looks like in a minute. It'll be easier to conceive this. But each item is reviewed independently and essentially blindly by 2 people. If their review matches, if 2 people say it's in copyright or 2 people say something's in the public domain, that's accepted. If you have a mismatch, one person says one thing and one says another, those get routed to what we call an expert. And they're not necessarily copyright experts, but they are process experts. And they can look at the reasons that the reviewer elected one option or another and make a decision. So anything that's complicated, as I mentioned, goes into that undetermined patch. We took the same methodology, made another proposal to the IMLS. In this proposal, we said we would continue the U.S. works, which we've now concluded, and we were going to add reviews for books published outside the United States. We picked these 3 countries because they're linguistically similar. We didn't have experience. There's so much to do in English, as you saw from Cobb's initial pie chart, that it didn't make sense right at that moment to try to do some of the other languages. But we did agree in this grant to make some effort. So we have developed an initial, we're testing an interface for books from Spain. And we did that partly in honor of the Computents, but also because my long-term view is that Spain and Spanish language materials are so important for North America that I'd like to be able to tackle that in some more cohesive way at some point. So we're testing an interface for that. But the basic methodology is the same. We use the Berne Convention framework. We look at the laws of those individual countries. We're focused on the 1870s to the 1940s. And 1870 is usually used as sort of a safe cutoff for assuming things prior to 1870 are in the public domain. This project is very much about identifying reliable author death dates. We are using, again, similar resources, but we're looking at somewhat different things. We don't tend to need the the registration records because they're not relevant for this kind of research. Again, 2 independent reviews, expert conflict of review, and we set aside anything that's undetermined, anything difficult. So taking a step back from the 2 grants, the essential methodology is that we pick a particular class of works. And when I say a class of works, I mean as a legal matter. This doesn't work well when you have different regimes in the same inquiry, because we're trying to have reviewers who are not necessarily copyright experts. I'll tell you 2 things about copyright expertise. The more you know, the harder it is to make a decision. And when I was first at the library, there were some students who put together, at the library at the University of Michigan, there were some students who put together a copyright Jeopardy game. And me and my predecessor, a woman named Molly Kleiman, who knows a lot about copyright and publishing, were paired off against some of these students. And we lost. And we lost because we're like, well, it depends. And that's not going to cut it. Not for this. So, at one point, I remember talking with Anne about, should these be catalogers or should we be hiring temps so that they're only people who, the less they know, is that going to work better? But that didn't actually work that well. But I'm just trying to make a point. So we narrow the legal framework. We say books, some narrow class as best we can. We translate that to an algorithm. If published, if in the U.S., if one author, we sort of work out a basic algorithm. We have 4 people who are actually paid full-time who are not cost share on the grant. It's Rick, who's our project manager. Christine, half of Christina's time is on the grant, and she is both a reviewer and sort of our quality control conscience. We have a lawyer named Justin Bonfiglio, who stayed home to watch the shop today. And we have a programmer named Moses Hall, who is spectacular and has been, we've worked more and more with him. Because we've worked together and he's worked on these issues now for going on 6 years, he's got the rare capacity of a programmer to listen to a bunch of lawyers and humanities people, figure out what they're doing, and be able to translate that. And that's been a very valuable dynamic to develop. It doesn't just happen. Anyway, we translate that to an algorithm. He expresses that as a working interface. The candidates are then reviewed in the interface, so you log in from your account at Columbia and you can see certain things. And then we go through this process. They confirm that the catalog record is correct. So sometimes the catalog record that comes up isn't accurate to the book. So there's one sort of it just happens, or the author is incorrect. Like we've had, there are other situations where we've had situations, this would not be a wrong catalog record, but you'll have a book that was published in 1950 and it'll say the author is Rembrandt. And I know that's wrong. But really it's a book by someone at the Metropolitan Museum about Rembrandt, and they've just mislisted the publisher, the author, for some reason. So they'll check the front matter, they'll consult the resources. We have defined resources that at minimum we ask them to check, and they make a decision. So the results are legally reliable because we narrow the scope of inquiry. We're still dealing with a lot of work, a lot of scale, as you saw in those earlier slides, but we're narrowing the questions. We have auditable methods, so we can go back and check all of the decisions. There's a notes field, and all the decisions are registered in a database. We have standardized training, and this was one of the big, I'd say, innovations between the first grant and the second. The first grant, I think, was very much about figuring out how to do this, but it wasn't scalable in terms of, there was only one Anne and she couldn't be everywhere. And Skype, did Skype exist? Like, sort of, you kind of maybe, like you couldn't teach the way you have, say, Adobe Connect or other tools like that for broader distance teaching, even a few years ago. And we set aside anything that's out of scope. So this is what the interface looks like. And I know Zach's going to talk about some of these things. So like you log in with your secured account. You have to use a computer at your office. It has to be designated. There's an IP address. I'm emphasizing this because the security of the scans is such an important component of what we need to be responsible for. This one, let's see, what does it say? 1898. We're going to go with that's been the public domain, okay? So I can show you this scan unabashedly. One of the things that we also tell reviewers is this stuff is so interesting, and you can't let yourself actually start to look at the books as books. You have to like kind of keep yourself moving. So anyway, you'd see a picture of the scan, excuse me. You have a menu in the center that lets you navigate the book. So you can pick a scrolling view that goes up and down. You can flip, because you may need to look at some of the front matter. You may need to check a few things. And you have some orienting tools for moving through the work as you need to. On your left, at the top of that sort of blue-gray column, the main things are, at the very top you have information pulled from the catalog record. So that's where you'd have the date of publication is listed and so forth. I mean, sometimes I'll see things where the date of publication will be a span of years. And it will be a series of books published over, say, 150 years, but it'll be one record. And so I have to go and check every single one of those because the record isn't there, and that's okay. So this view 1 and view 2, you can toggle between different views. So you can look at the book, and then you can toggle to some of the other reference tools without leaving the interface. You can adjust the sizes. This is a world review, so the questions being asked are answered in the middle where it says author death date. You wouldn't necessarily have that in, say, the US review because that wasn't really relevant. Ideally, we have an author death date. Sometimes those are pulled automatically from the Merlin or from the HathiTrust's record. In many cases, there's a death date. We still validate it to make sure it's the right author and the right death date. We had maybe 50,000 that pulled automatically from the University of Michigan's catalog records when we realized we could actually do that. Sometimes you can't find a publication, an author death date, for any number of reasons, or you can't really confirm it's the right Bob Smith from Canada who wrote about tennis. And we'll ask people to put in a publication date, and we can make assumptions. The system generally, because of that algorithm, based on the facts you've got already inserted, will populate this rights reason code, the buttons, these down here, this part right here. So one of those should turn positive. Now, the reviewer still may identify something that makes it really belong in the unidentified UND category. Where it says notes, there's a drop-down menu, and it has a number of different kinds of categories of things that might exclude a work. Or you may just want to put in a note. So there's a category that says expert note, and I might just put in, some unique thing that needs to be noted about that book. All of that goes to the database, and then you submit. Okay. So as I mentioned, one of the big innovations between the first grant and the second was being able to expand the number of reviewers, expand the number of participants. We have a lot of different documentation. This will look familiar to Anne. It's still getting used. We have a lot of flowcharts. They look like this, and they look like this. And I'm not going to go through any of them. I'm just sharing that we have a lot of documentation. One was the decision tree for the US process. One is World, and you can see the World process, again, because it's a simpler inquiry. It's a simpler it looks simpler, because it is. We have a wiki, which documents policy decisions, not the individual decisions, but say we have a new question come up. We had a question about, say, Crown copyright and how to apply it in certain situations. Usually there's some email exchange. Usually it's facilitated by Christina with one or more reviewers as a list. Sometimes she can make the determination on her own. Sometimes she'll check with me or Justin as sort of the attorney experts. Frequently, it's a problem-solving thing. We document all of that in the wiki. The wiki is a formal documentation and guidance so that we have consistent decision-making, but it's written in an informal style to make it really usable for the people participating. So at some point, I'd sort of like to publish it or publish a version of it, but we have to, I think, make it more ready for a different kind of prime time. But I just wanted you to be aware of the kinds of tools. We didn't have that in the first grant, did we? We did have that. Oh, that's right. U.S. There's. You're right. I'm telling you that Anne thought of everything. So again, we couldn't clone Anne. She could only be at the different institutions. Those 3 partners initially, a limited amount of time. So in this grant, we had a group of those partner institutions designees for this process fly to Ann Arbor for 1 meeting, and I think it was a 2-day meeting. From that, from training people in person and from watching what they understood, how they understood, where they didn't understand things, we were better able to present the training material, so that kind of travel isn't. I don't think it's necessary. Now we might occasionally want to test, like it's like which M&M is the best color, which like to almost do market research to see how effective the training is and what we could do to make it more efficient or effective. We did look at a train the trainer model, and we found that it created a lot of inconsistency. So it sounds good, but we could, this is one of those like open-ended questions, if we had a much more formalized way of training more trainers, and making the decision-making more rigid, so that we didn't have, a person at Columbia saying something different than a person in Minnesota, and then you have reviewers trained with slightly different understandings, and that won't work. We really are focusing on the centralized training, the centralized coordination, but trying to expand that as large as we can. In addition to the materials I just mentioned, we have video tutorials. Christina can train people through doing screen sharing. And we found at the beginning of the grant, we didn't really know what was going to make a good reviewer. We didn't know really how much time, what made sense. And what we found over time is that ranks either don't matter, or, as I said, like lawyers probably wouldn't be good reviewers. They might be good expert reviewers for certain kinds of things. Rank's not so much an issue. We have had some surprisingly senior people want to do this and participate, but that's really not so much the issue. The level of education isn't necessarily the issue. There are a lot of catalogers who maybe have been doing cataloging for many years, but maybe don't have a graduate degree. It really depends, and some of them are very good at what they do. What we did find that matters a lot is the time commitment. Really having the carve out in the day and having the supervisors know that Melissa's going to spend 25% of her time, and really watch her schedule, because if Melissa isn't logging in regularly, not just a day a week, but like a couple hours a day, because you can get rusty on this. It's easy to do if you do it regularly, but it's hard to do if you don't do it for a week or a month. And what's interesting is Zach will show you some dashboard slides. So Christina, individual reviewers can see stats about their own reviews, but Christina can see what everybody's doing. And you can tell when everybody goes on vacation at the end of summer or around December, the number of reviews drop off, the quality drops off a little bit, most of it comes right back up. But sometimes with some individuals it doesn't. And typically where people really have a hard time is if they're committed only 5%, the smaller percentages. And we really wanted as much inclusion from partners initially as possible. So I'm inclined to say, yeah, 5% is great, join the club. Didn't work so well. That I think was really harder, even when the people were very capable. 25%, around 20% seems to be the sweet spot. The other challenge we realized in talking about this presentation was that many of the reviewers were signing on for like at least a 3-year project with the way these grants. That's a long time to be doing this. It's like the Gilligan's Island of copyright. You thought you were going to go on a 3-hour tour, but one of the things that Bob and I are like, as we're looking at the future, is how can we do this with smaller bites? How could I have a 25% of your time for 6 months? And if the training is efficient enough and you're fresh enough, you can kind of dip in and out. And if you want to do it again in a year, you could have deans of libraries saying, yes, Melissa can go back and do it for this 6 months. I think it's more satisfying, and there's maybe less burnout. So we're looking at different ways of having the right expertise and the right energy around this. It is incredibly satisfying to see the works, like to know that you've contributed to making these things that, if you don't know they're in the public domain, you can't do anything with them. But knowing you're making that difference, I think, is actually quite significant. So I've already mentioned the other factors, the dedicated hours, and really the limited interruption. So no internet surfing. Stay off Etsy, Okay. So we've talked a little, I've implied this, but one of the vulnerabilities we have thinking out long term as a project beyond a grant-funded project is staffing changes. So there's a normal ebb and flow. People take new jobs. There's that kind of thing. That's not really such a concern. We can train new people. We can even have new, management. If I go on to become some fabulous new thing, I don't know what that might be. We don't have a lot of depth. There's just me, Christina, Rick, Moses, Justin in the middle. And we really want to have more depth. So we try to cross-train among ourselves, but I can't help them be lawyers, and Lord, this whole thing would come to a stop if they were. So this is one of the reasons we're so rigorous about our documentation. We talk a lot about trying to do more cross-training, but we need to figure out how to expand that skill set. Okay. For thinking about new projects, we know that these are core qualities. The double review. There are times where I'm really sorely tempted to just do one review because something seems so simple. But that auditability and that confidence level that we get out of having the resources invested in doing the 2 reviews, I think is both substantively incredibly important. Christina's nodding. She's heard me feel that temptation. She's like, nope. I think it's a really important feature of this. So what we're learning. When we started this project, we thought we could crowdsource because, everybody can crowdsource. It's the coolest thing, right? It's easy. It's not easy. We think we could probably crowdsource some tool just identifying author death dates. I saw a presentation by somebody at something called Tilt Factor, which is at Dartmouth. The principal, I cannot think of the ones, Mary, and forgive me, I should be making a call out for her. But Tilt Factor does gaming. This woman works in the psychology of games, and she has set up a number of different tools that are being used by librarians and by digital library projects to describe materials. So you can log in, you can make an account, or you can do this, independently, and you can have a series of images just flash in front of you, and you just describe them. And so you'll have, 3 lumberjacks standing around a log and a saw. So you'd say men, log, saw, tree, very associative, and when you run out next. So then they can look at all those descriptors of data. So if I put in hammerhead shark, that would probably be an outlier for that slide, and it would just get pitched. There's a lot of interesting ideas. So we do have a lot of standard resources for the author death dates, but it's actually amazing how hard it is to find certain kinds of things. VIAF has helped because it's really easy to use, and it pulls from all the different national libraries, all of their data. So I think there's something very accomplishable there. The question is then what do you do with it? Because we still have to actually look at the books. This could be more efficient. And I suspect as we're talking about like the what next over the next probably 6 months or so, it may be that there are other ideas about taking this whole thing apart, reserving the core methodology, and doing it in a very different way. I don't know. So we are working with ongoing improvement. We are looking at dealing with copyright country by country. So this is our knotty issues. The undetermines. We would like at some point to go back to that bucket of we don't know, and trying to figure out, well, do the we don't knows fall into any patterns? Could we now analyze them differently? How can we figure them out? The biggest we don't know is become the phrase inserts. And this is maybe an unfortunate expression that comes from the failed Google settlements. But it's the idea that you have photos or independently credited elements of a book, maybe different chapters by different authors. That wouldn't really be an issue, but you might have a forward. And so we have criteria for our reviewers to say, okay, is the book overall in the public domain? Let's say yes. But if there's a forward that has like significant independent authorship or creativity, we might keep that closed because we don't know what the copyright status of that component is. So all things that might fall into this category are probably a lot of things like museum catalogs, things that are image heavy where we just don't know. Now it's likely a lot of the images are in the public domain, but that's the kind of thing that we sort of put those aside. I don't know what percentage we have of things that are books that are in the public domain that are kept closed because we have this other image issue. I think it's in the tens of thousands. So I look at that and I'm like, oh, that's not significant when we're dealing with 11 million, but that's, if you want that book, it's an issue. Because we're moving more and more into the international realm, we're dealing with GATT, but we're also dealing with GATT. Are you familiar with this issue in general, the GATT issue? So the U.S. Joined certain international treaties in the mid-90s. There were books that had fallen and entered the public domain in the United States, both by foreign authors, by all kinds of people, because they failed to meet the formalities. They weren't registered, they weren't renewed, some issue along those lines. Under this treaty, eligible works, that would be Berne Convention countries, who had authors whose work had entered the public domain in the United States, but essentially were still protected abroad. I'm simplifying this immensely. Those books were sort of resuscitated from the public domain back into copyright in the United States. So this is very, very controversial in a number of different ways, but we had to go back and look at our U.S. reviews to try to identify which of the authors may have been foreign authors, because the fact that they had been registered, that they had failed formality wasn't sufficient. And VIAF has been a really helpful tool for that. So we had, say, British authors who may have died in the 2000s, but we had books, say, from 1950 that had failed formalities, so we had them open, but technically they're subject to GATT because the person only died fairly recently. So VIAF has been a really helpful tool for identifying nationality. But we're seeing another issue. We're doing this project right now. With VIAF, you can have different countries claim nationality differently. So we've seen, and this is purely anecdotal, but we see a number of authors where, like, the German National Library will identify someone as German, or the Russian records say they're Russian. But it's really interesting that they were emeritus faculty at Columbia and happened to come to the United States in the 30s or 40s. And they're not all Jewish, but a lot of them are. And you could tell, that there's a migration issue. So I think there's some very interesting work about either brain drain or something. But the point is, even rely on VIAF entirely to say that this person was or wasn't an American. So we will check to say, in cases that look like they have those kind of components, we'll look for obituaries or other information to see if it's likely, when people were, it's pretty apparent they were fleeing the Holocaust from their data. And they, their children were born in the United States. It's pretty apparent that they were American let's say, at the time a particular book was published. So it's a fascinating area. It's a little bit of a headache, but it's interesting enough to warrant all this, and it's significant. Right now, we put aside dissertations because there's a lot of question about whether they're published or not published, and we would need authorship information, death dates, and it's at some point somebody's going to want to tackle that, but it's not us right now. And dictionaries, because there's a lot of discussion about, they are subject to copyright, but they're not particularly original. And those are actually some of the very early copyright disputes under American law. Okay, some of the pilot projects that we're either working on or thinking about, and I'll try to wrap up so Zach has some time. We are developing a toolkit, so we're trying to sort of sum up the experience of the last 6 years, try to tease out like sort of the critical things so that people can take the core methodology, and even if they're outside of HathiTrust, maybe this framework can be useful for other people doing other kinds of projects as a reliable framework. We are looking at ways to expand our scope beyond English. So I mentioned that we have an interface dealing with Spanish books, in both language and Spain. So it's not Spanish books from Venezuela, it's just Spanish law. I'm hoping to do a project with Gregory Crane, who's known for the Perseus Project, to look at, he hasn't given me the list yet, but now that this is being recorded, he's going to have to give me the list of about 5,000 classics that are either translations or by German scholars. A lot of it's in Latin or Greek, and we just need to confirm the identity and the death dates of a lot of the German author, editor, translators. We will probably be working with several HathiTrust partners in the United States to actually do the reviews, but most of these books are already visible in the United States because they were published before 1923, but they're not available outside the United States until we do the reviews. So, especially for, say, German scholars and classics, it's frustrating. Okay, so we're also working on United States state government documents. This is a fairly new thing. We basically took the people who were working on the U.S. reviews, whose work closed when they finished that candidate pool, and we've trained them to look at state government docs. So you may know that works by federal employees in the scope of their employment are in the public domain. Those are not subject to copyright. But that's not true for state employees and state works. So those are subject to copyright by the states. And there's a wide range of practices around this. Most of it's just sort of, my impression is it's benign negligence. It's like they've published things, they're available, they don't worry about this. But these could be like the reports of the New York Railroad Commission from 1900 to 1970, banking commissions, things like that. There are McCarthy-era commissions in California that were looking at citizenship, communism, things like that are mind-boggling and really important. None of these have copyright notices on them. And I don't think they were registered for copyright. I don't think states were thinking about that because that wasn't really our mission. But the main thing is they don't have copyright notices on them. And early on in the project, there was some question about, do we have enough confidence in scans to say if there's you have to be very confident that scan is an accurate representation of the book, that it's not missing a page, that there's not something blotted out. But basically, we have pretty high confidence in these now. And so we basically are very simply checking these resources for a copyright notice up to a certain date. If it's not there, then we are treating them as public domain. So there's about 60,000 in that category. And with state government docs, the same theory could apply to other kinds of works, but these are things that are sort of high value, low risk in terms of states having an interest in enforcing copyright on any particular one of these kinds of works. So we're focusing on that now. We've talked a little bit about undetermined, and this is just this and my thank you. As I said, the books are really, really interesting. So we had an intern last summer, and every now and then someone will do a little blog post to talk about a book they found in the public domain that's really interesting. So my three, and this is my pitch for one of the reasons I love the public domain. This is fodder for amazing screenplays. 12 Years a Slave is in HathiTrust's. My 3 Years in Manipur and Escape from the Recent Mutiny by Ethel St. Clair Grimwood is crazy amazing. It's this woman who lived in India. She was British, yes, British. This is about sort of her adventures in different, she was the wife, I think, of a British administrator, and she experiences sort of different competing battle things, military things. She ends up back in England. She dies, was it in Oregon? In like it was before, like 1910 at the latest. How does this woman die in Oregon? Like, this life story is like, and I think it wasn't blood poisoning. What was the expression? Toxic something. She must, I think it's alcoholism. And I'm like, who's going to play that role? Like that, there's like some really good female roles in that one. Christina found this Schools in Wartime, which was like World War II era. Is that right? Resource. My Strange Pets is another, like, really interesting. And the car was Little Cars and Voiturettes from what time frame? Well, can anybody date that car? So, anyway, I want to thank all of you. I hope that was interesting. It's a lot of process, and I told you we're not going to talk about orphan work, so there you have it. Zach, you're up.